What's up, bookworms? This is Megan coming at you with another Cantina conversation. Today's episode features a chat with Kimberly Brock. We're talking about her book, The Fabled Earth. That book is available now. I really enjoyed getting to know Kimberly, and just I loved her energy and all the information like from her brain about where she grew up and just her experiences and how they like the folklore and the histories of just like historical events really kind of inspired her to write this story, which kind of eerie, eerie vibe, southern folklore vibe. And but once you guys pick it up, you'll know what I mean. But either way, I'll let you guys get to it. Here is Kimberly. So today we've got Kimberly Brock here. We're talking about The Fabled Earth. That book is available now as well tomorrow as of this recording, but it will be available now if you're listening to this. Kimberly, thanks for joining me today. I just finished this. It's fresh in my brain, very eerie but very like homey vibe, and I appreciated like getting to know all the characters. Like, they're complicated and I wanted to know what the heck happened in 1932. So
Me
I'm
too.
like, you pulled us along. Yeah. You pulled us along, so I'm excited to dig a little bit deeper today.
Thank you for having me. This is always fun when you get to talk to somebody who's read the book. It's like you have a dream and you want to tell somebody, and most people don't care about your dream and they're like just glazed over and not listening. But when somebody's read your book, it's like you both had the dream and you get to talk about it.
Yeah, yeah, I know, that's so funny because yeah, that's a similar sentiment for when I talk to authors. Because yeah, it's even if something's bugging me, I'm like, all right, I got a bone to
Yeah.
pick with you. Like, so it's, wait a second, did I miss something, or is this like you did this to your characters because it's
Yeah.
fun? It probably was to like just put them through it. So yeah, but before we get started, can you share like a summary of the book so that people can follow along with the conversation?
The Fabled Earth is my third novel. It is a Southern Gothic historical fiction. I guess I would say there are three women in this novel who are point of view characters and two timelines. So it's a dual timeline. And the characters are Cleo Woodbine, who is a woman who comes to Cumberland Island, Georgia in 1932. And then she is in 1959 timeline when a girl whose mother was there with Cleo in 1932 comes to town with some questions about what happened. And then there's a third character named Audrey Howell, who is an innkeeper, a young innkeeper who is recently widowed. And she takes a photograph. And when she develops, it's an eerie double exposure, and everybody thinks she has a picture of a ghost on her hands. And it is the face of a boy who disappeared in 1932. So their lives intertwine around that mystery. And then the story plays out in 1959. There's a storm bearing down on this little town, and Cleo is a very reclusive woman, and she's having to make some decisions. And there's a lot of social change going on in 1959. And in the background are the Carnegie summer homes that were built on Cumberland Island, Georgia. And they're crumbling and spooky and wonderful. And the largest one historically burned in an arson in 1959. We don't know who committed that crime, but I like to speculate a little bit in the book about what happened.
Yeah, so that fire, that arson, that was, I know this is historical fiction. So you didn't, that burning that actually did
Yes.
happen then, and you're integrating that in your story. That's so cool. I know, because I'm like, oh, I like historical fiction. The more I read it, the more I enjoy it, because it's cool to see what authors do with historical events and how they like tell character stories and the development and revolving around those events. No, that's really cool that you integrated that within the story, because I imagine I'm not familiar with that area, but just reading the story, I definitely got like the vibe. I got the gist that it was just like very well renowned in that area. Like, these were the people, this was the upper class, and this was well known. What they would come and guided, they would do these hunts, and they would have these old boys clubs or whatever. And so it was like, it was a cool way to introduce that, like a power dynamic, but like the social
Oh, yeah.
class, like
It's a
that kind
total
of
power dynamic.
discrepancy for
Yeah,
real.
so I grew up in North Georgia, in the
Mhm.
foothills, and I know you can't tell listening to this accent, right? But I my first trip to the ocean was down on the Georgia coast, and I had never been to Cumberland Island. It's the southernmost island off the coast of the state of Georgia, and it is
Mm,
wild. It's a beautiful, mostly undeveloped island, but the Carnegie family in the 1800s bought property there and built a huge summer mansion called Dungeness. And Dungeness is the house
mhm.
that's in this book. There are several other homes that are featured in this book that the Carnegie family also built. They had 9 children to build houses for.
There we
Right.
go.
The only one that is still standing, that's not true. Plum Orchard, that's also featured in the book, is still standing and beautiful, and you can tour it. But the one that you can stay in as an inn is called Grayfield. And my husband and I went there for our 25th wedding anniversary. I had always wanted to see Cumberland, and I was enchanted with the idea of Grayfield in particular because in 1996 is when we got married, and JFK Jr. got married on Cumberland in a secret wedding that
Oh,
same
wow.
summer. News, and just thinking, oh, that's romantic. Isn't that cool that it's here in Georgia? And then I remember the tragedy of that plane crash a few years later, and I was obsessed with that.
Mm.
So when I had not even thought about that though, when we went to Cumberland for our anniversary until we pulled up alongside the island and those oak trees and all that Spanish moss, and it's totally wild. It's a national park now. Very quiet as we pulled up there, and I thought, oh, this would have been their 25th wedding anniversary too. And all the
Mm.
hair stood up on
Yeah.
my head, and I thought, if I was ever going to write a ghost story, this was the place to do it. And that's where kind of the idea began. And then I thought, the next thought from that was, our stories do haunt us, right? What if they really walked with us? What if they really literally walked along beside us? And so I started thinking about Cleo Woodbine and these imaginary friends from her childhood, and the idea that they would haunt her as an adult and keep her company on this little island she's living on as a recluse. So that's where that comes from. And the idea of the Carnegies in the background of that Southern Gothic little town, 1959, I wanted that mythology of them, like the old gods over on the island that are slowly
Mm.
disappearing because times were changing.
Mm.
Yeah, I loved it. And they're just so weird, those Gilded Age mansions there. They look like they just dropped from the sky. Like, how did they get here? They don't belong here at all. You associate that with the East Coast up north, not southern Georgia. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I could totally see that because up north or like in New York or like upstate New
Hmm.
York even. That's when I hear Gilded Age, that's like where I
Right.
associate that from. And yeah, maybe yeah, that family just wanted to bring by their own little land and their own slice of it and bring they just we want to be down here, but we want all the stuff from
That
up
is
there. We
exactly
like that
true, and it
style. So
made them
it's
so
like,
interesting
yeah,
to me. And their kids growing
yeah.
up there, though, are different because that's their home. They love that place. They value that place. They want to protect it. And then, but I thought a lot about what brings a person there to do that, to create that kind of a kingdom unto itself there. And when I started thinking those in those terms and those words, that's very Edgar Allan Poe, right? Kingdom by the Sea, and so all
Mm.
of that imagery was coming to me as I was writing it.
Yeah, I could tell that you were really trying to like, yeah, because it was easy to picture and just get the sense of, I don't know if energy is like a weird way to say it, but it's like the vibe or the tone of it. And even though I could tell even when you're talking about when you were visiting it on your anniversary, how you just like the
Yeah,
energy that you were getting off that place. You were just like, it wasn't
you
leaving you
know,
alone. It stood
yeah,
out to you. Yeah, and I could totally relate to that because there's certain places where I've been to visit where I'm like, you can like sense a shift a
yep.
little bit and it's just like
It's an amazing
where it's
place.
just, "Wait a
It is a
second."
place that makes you
Yeah.
reflect. You stand there and
Mhm.
you're very
Mhm.
aware of yourself in it. And I wanted each of those women to experience that too. I love that it feels very outside of time in a way. And the
Mhm.
town that is on the coast that's featured in the novel is fictional. It's based on some actual towns that are there nearby. But I didn't want it to be too real because I like how it all feels just a little bit mythical and a little bit like you've stepped outside of reality a little bit for these characters for this summer. And so I enjoyed visiting the actual place and finding that it exists almost exactly as it exists in my imagination, which is fantastic. You don't find that very often, right?
Yeah.
And then I finished the book and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, everybody's want to go see Cumberland Island. And I thought, oh no, don't go see it. Leave it alone.
Yeah. That's where you gotta finish in your, like, your
Yeah,
author notes or whatever, like, "Thank you, reader, now leave
yeah,
it alone." Like,
don't go.
that's so funny. Yeah, just, "Oh, it's precious, appreciate
Yeah,
it from afar. Look at just
yeah.
Google it," whatever.
And I love too
That's
that
so funny.
it's big and beautiful and fantastic. And the flip side of that is that it's not. There's a lot going
Mm,
wrong. There's a very real story happening here. There are very real issues with these people. And I think we think about in literature, especially, we think about the southern United States that way. It's this dreamscape in our minds, whether it's a horror or whether it is a paradise. It's not real to people. And I wanted to have that juxtaposition where you have that represented that way as that sort of Eden, but then you take a look at the people and you realize, oh, and that's where all the folklore comes in for me and the ghost stories, right?
yeah. Yeah, because you do obviously the overarching, like, storyline is the stories, like, people's lives and are they linger, like, it becomes part of the island's story, part of the land's story, and it's uncovered even generations later, it's uncovered, but it's just, like, you still feel that presence there. And just the implications with the residents, because you have Cleo, who's she seems like she's punishing herself
She
almost,
is,
or
yeah,
I have to, this was for me, I have to stay here kind of thing. And we'll get into it, but then there's Frances, who's she's like coming back because she wants to figure things out, and it was also like a little bit of unfinished business. So she's like almost like an outsider, but not
right.
really. And then there's Audrey, who's the gist that I got from her was just, yeah, she's currently living there, but she's part of that second generation. She wasn't part of that first go around with the story took place. She's part of the new. She's just like a little bit of that new hope, even though she's had a heartbreaking story so far, even at the young age. She's, she's been going through it already when we meet her as the reader. I'm gonna hop around a bit. So with your so this is your third novel. What like draws you to the genre? Like with aligning of it like the folklore and stuff, and also piggybacking off of that, do you tend to switch timelines and points of view in your other work? Was this like the first time you were playing along with that?
I do it every time, whether I mean to or not. I don't write anything in a straight line. My husband and I laugh about the way that I think. It's like a web, or I've heard people talk about how a moth operates, where a moth will dart from one area to another area, and they're tasting the air, right? And eventually they get where they go. And that's how I write. I
Mhm.
think. um, so I always have more than one story spinning at a time, more than one character that is looking at the same thing. I want to see what they
Mhm.
see. I want to see, oh, well, if I look at it this way
Mhm.
from this place and this person, what do I see if I look at it this way? And then I'm really interested in how those people interact from those different positions and perspectives. I think it is me subconsciously trying to decide what I think about something. Folklore is really important to me in my writing. I love folklore. I love ghost stories. I think because those were the stories I grew up hearing, not necessarily reading, right? They were stories that were
It's like word of
Yeah,
mouth,
stories that
right?
we were
Oral
told at
storytelling, yeah.
bedtime, at sleepovers, stories that my grandparents told, stories I remember hearing people tell sitting around the kitchen table, or those things that were passed down. And it's very intriguing to me to think about why those stories in particular last, why we tell them over and over again, generation after generation, how they travel
Mm,
from generation to generation. So they travel through time, they travel through generations, through families. They travel through communities. They travel across countries. They travel across oceans. And yet, there are parts of them that stay the same. And I want to know why. And I want to look at where they came from and why. And I think they always manage to sneak their way into my work because I like thinking about that. This
mhm,
book, one of the reasons that the folklore is there is because when I got to Cumberland and I was learning more and more about it, first of all, the history there is so freaking long. You just are lost in it. And if I'm not a historian, I'm a storyteller. So every story I
mhm.
read, I was like, ooh, this is the best one. This is the one I'm going to write about. And then I would find the next one and the next one, and centuries of stories about this place. And I could not latch on to. I knew the fire. How are you not going to write about that fire, because it's just such a spectacular thing. But
Mhm.
the landscape itself, there's a river, and the river has a spot in it that locals, and this is not unusual for places that have salt water marshes and creeks, that has a spot called the dividings where the tide runs both ways.
Mhm.
And that is what a story is. I think our stories are the most human thing about us, the thing that makes us human, that we tell stories. And in order to tell a story, you have to be able to travel in both directions. You have to reflect, you have to exist in the moment, and then you also have to be able to dream. And you have to be able to do all three at the same time. And that's what folklore is, I think. That's what ghost stories are. And I wanted to write a story about that. So here you go.
That's so profound and, like, really cool to point out. Cause yeah, you're absolutely right. That's, like, part of the human experience is the storytelling. It's when you can even argue that it could be, like, expanded through just, like, what makes us so complex is just, like, the artistry of it. Like, whether you're telling a story through just oral, like, around the campfire, or you're writing a book, or even using, like, paints like
Aha!
Cleo and,
You are good.
with
Right, right
her
back.
stories. Yeah,
You saw that, did you? So yeah, I used
little
it
bit,
all
yeah.
in this book. So I loved. I wish I could paint. I'm not a painter. Maybe I could be if I tried, but I haven't done that since I was a kid. But I love to think that I could. I love all different kinds of storytelling expression. And so I wanted to use those here. The music for Audrey Howell has the record collection from her recently deceased young husband. So you've got all that 1940s, 1950s music, and it's storytelling. It's so fun to listen to,
Mhm.
and it's telling her story, and it's in what he has chosen to keep tells his story a little bit, even though he's not even in the book. And the photography that she does is telling a story. The movie theater plays a role in the book. The library plays a role in the book. So everything is about the storytelling aspect of it. And then Leo's paintings were because when I was a kid, I loved those. You remember the worksheets they would give you that had hidden figures, hidden images that you had to
Mm.
find the hidden thing. So when we got to Cumberland,
Yeah.
that was one of my first thoughts was this place looks like there ought to be hidden
Yeah.
things that I could find everywhere I look. And so I thought that played into the idea of how she saw Cumberland and how her folklore from her grandfather figures into that, where that shows up for her in that imagery. So all of that art, all of it is really just storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Experience the world.
And it's such a strong way to tie all of that together, almost like in a little bow. It's yeah, it's about the characters, but overall, it's like when you look at the big picture, it's like how do these stories come to be, and who's telling them, and who are they about, and how long do they last, and what changes or what gets lost in translation,
Mhm.
or lost over time. And just because, yeah, like nowadays we're in the age of technology where we're a little bit spoiled. But for example, for the boy that went missing, and then all of a sudden he appears, and it's just like this mystery rehashed like almost 30 years later. And we'll try to be spoiler free, obviously, but it's nobody really knows like what happened, and it's a matter of somebody knows. It's just for some reason that information is not reaching everyone. And it's work as a reader, I'm at least from my experience, I was feeling for these characters. It's, wait, I want to know what happened too. Wait a second, what's going on here? What do you mean? Why is there the last? As soon as like some of those details were mentioned, it was like, oh crap, because it was the boy that went missing. It was just like one of those, we kind of, he stood out right away, right? As soon as we're introduced to him, he stood out, and we knew that he was going to be important. But it was also a little heartbreaking because just with the whole racist, like class
Yeah.
divides, and all that, and how that was just like, oh no, that's not going to look good and stuff like that. When it's just, it could have just been nothing more than like an innocent friendship or companionship from people who were, they're on an island. What are they gonna do? Or on this like where they're all there for a reason. And it's just it's just all these more complicated storylines, influences that are getting in the way of something that doesn't even need to be that good. And he ended up making huge impact elsewhere, even just being absent. Like I said, I'm gonna bounce around a lot. So I wanna know, you tapped on this earlier with, like, your research. Was there anything that you found, like, anything fascinating or surprising that you learned while you were, like, digging in and falling through all these, like, rabbit holes and, like, trying to put the pieces together and stuff like that?
I think research for Cumberland was, it wasn't that it was surprising, but it was that it was strange. There are strange
Mm,
stories. There are heartbreaking stories because you have a group of people who have such a vast wealth. And when they built these homes, everything had to be brought to the island. Everything on a daily basis by boat. There
mhm.
was a lot of money that went into just keeping the place running and habitable. Not just that it was so grand, they were grand mansions.
Right.
But then they also had their eccentricities. There was a little airstrip. All of these celebrities came back and forth, were entertained there. There are all kinds of fun and weird stories about people who visited the island. There were all kinds of wild and crazy animals that they kept, and all of the things that you would imagine. But it's beautiful in this quiet way too, because the place is very private, and I can imagine what that would have meant, right? To have that privacy, sometimes to be that far away, to live in this wilderness, because it is a wilderness. I loved the idea of some of the true historical figures and what their lives must have been like there. Surprising. I'm trying to think. Weirdly, I'll tell you a little side note, has nothing to do with Cumberland. So I made up, and this is the part about writing any kind of fiction, but also what's most exciting when you're writing historical fiction are the things that line up that you make up, and then you find out that they exist somehow. When I was growing up, we had a historic movie theater that I loved. It was my first movie that I went to, and it had this beautiful marquee that lit up. And like at night, sometimes we would drive by just to see it because it was pretty at night. And the first time we were there, I had to go to the bathroom. I was 3 or 4 years old, and there was this little tiny staircase to go up to this little tiny bathroom. And my grandmother said, "Now hurry up, don't let the ghost get you." And of course, I was thrilled. We loved that. That was just teasing. We weren't like scared, but I remember that, and it was something we liked to do. And so that went into my thinking about writing the Marvel Theater. But I made up the idea that there's a tunnel in my fiction novel that is connected to the
Mhm.
Marvel Theater. Turns out, when I was talking to my dad, there is also a tunnel that connects the theater that I grew up going to the building next door. And I had forgotten all about it when I first made it up. And so then I had to go and look and read about it. And I was like, oh, it's really there. It's really there. So those kinds of things are really fun. And then there are the sad things when you write historical fiction. I also completely imagine the scene with Audrey and the Beauty children and what happens outside the theater in Reverie in that scene. And I won't spoil it for anybody, but it was a week after I had drafted that scene when a friend let me know that her family had been involved in a documentary that was filmed in a local town here where I live in Georgia from the 1960s. And the event in my novel mirrored almost exactly what had happened
Oh,
in this place
wow.
that my husband and I go eat at a restaurant in this little town like every couple of months. And I've stood there and looked at that theater before. So when you run across those truths like that, sometimes it's like in, I don't know, it just makes you feel like a little wink that you got it right and somebody's happy with you. And sometimes it's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, because it's the point was to like pack that emotional
Mm-hmm.
punch and to really get the readers to stop and think like why that chaos is happening, and only for you to find out like, oh shit, like that
Yeah,
actually is very similar to real actually life, like real life things that
sure.
did
And
happen. And
that feeling of, I
yeah.
can't believe that could really happen. That naive
Mhm.
feeling that we have, that we carry around, sense of safety and a sense that these things are stories from the past and they're not. And I wanted that to be present in my characters. None of the characters in this book are heroes. None of them are heroes. None of them are entirely villainous either, right? Some of them do things that wind up being choices that are, I don't know, brave in a moment, but it's not like they
Mhm.
plan to be standing there in that moment. And sometimes the choice that they make that seems brave is actually not. It's just what they did in the
Mhm.
moment and then they reflect on it.
Mhm.
And I think one of the most important things for me when I was writing this was to think about it that way, to stand there as that person, only knowing what you know in 1932 or 1959 and no more, because you want to put your spin on things sometimes when you're writing a historical fiction, and I tried to be really careful with that. It's the whole point, I think, of this book for me when I was writing it was to reflect, and I hope that's what it brings to the reader, is to reflect and then to dream.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like I have to keep reminding myself like what year it is, because like you think the 1959, the 60s, it's, oh, 40 years ago. No, that was like 60 years ago, and it's we're becoming further and further removed, I think, from points in history that we should like definitely keep in mind and remember, because that's like also running theme kind of in the book is like history repeating itself and these same like mentalities, these
Don't you
looks and
see them around
ways
you?
of
Yeah.
thinking. Yeah, it's like the parallels to real life here, and it's yeah, there were moments like that where it's just yeah, like it's sad how almost like obvious it is for me as a reader. I'm sure many readers out there who it's not flying over their heads, but then it's things are so charged in like our current climate right now, and it's just so frustrating. There's so many people who just either rose-colored glasses, or they turn a blind eye, or they just straight up denial and no, that's not how it is,
Oh,
and
you
it's
mean
just
Rosie
like
DeVan?
maybe not for like maybe if you're not in like your own little corner of your
Yeah.
little bubble, but even then I find myself the same sentiment where, oh, that doesn't, people aren't really like that, or this is dramatized for literature or whatever. But it's no, if I stepped out of my little bubble, I'm sure, for a day and eavesdropped in some conversations or even looked online, just there are certain alerts like notifications that I get. Like I don't really use Twitter that much, but I keep looking at the notifications just to remind myself of there are people that think
Yeah.
this way, and they write down their thoughts and they share their thoughts on the internet, and they also have the right to vote. And so I'm just like Things like that, it's really helpful, even though I don't wanna, like, sift through and just filter my feed or my notifications or my alerts to the world only from what I agree with. I wanna keep reminding myself that there's the thoughts that are very different that I disagree with or I'm just rolling my
Yeah.
eyes at.
So,
I'm like,
and the
"Idiot,
point of
idiot."
this
Like,
is that our stories are what connect us. Our that we are a living folklore. That's what we are. That's what all of our
mhm,
stories are. It's what our
mhm.
family stories are. It's what our country story is. There is no
Yeah.
separation, right? And that's what I was reaching for here. I don't think I'm. First of all, when I write a book, I always think, "Oh, what a wonderful idea," and then my next thought is, "I'm not smart enough to write that. I'll never." And then about halfway through the book, I'm like, "I was right. I'm never going to be smart
Yeah.
enough to write this." But when you get to the end, what you hope is that the writing of the book has made you smart enough to write the book because you learn along the way. So I think that was what I was trying to learn from this book. And I don't know, I think the right to read is very much present in this book. That's not because I was like looking to write a book about the right to read. I was just thinking about what would it be like because I grew up going to the library and loving our library. What would it be like if somebody said, "Sorry, you can't come in here. This is not for you." Or the
Yeah.
movie theater, or the I wanted to think about those things. I want to think about those things in my daily life now so that I'm aware of what it is to share our stories and to not shut each other down. And I think there's a danger when we don't tell those stories. I also think there's a danger when we make heroes out of people who are not. And
Oh,
that
yeah.
was something present
Absolutely.
in this a little. And even when you think you've done something great and wonderful, maybe you have to look at it a different way. Or you think you've done something shameful, maybe you have to look at it a different way. All of those themes went into this book. I wanted those three women to come at those questions from different places. And because they meet one another at this time and in this place, they see one another differently. They see themselves differently. I wanted them to be mirrors to one another.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I liked how you did that, how you found a way for them all to be connected, but all in different ways and all from a different perspective. From if we were looking at the property as its own character, as part of the story, it's like what perspective does that property have, the land have of these three women, or like vice versa? What's their perspective of this piece
Mhm.
of land and this history? And it's like they're all, yeah, they're all together and they're all eventually working with each other to help other people, but it's so crazy how different their backgrounds are, even though so similar as well. Like how they're all tied together by this land, by this folklore, by these stories, by these people, the community around them. One thing I did want to touch on, there's a couple, like obviously there's dark subject matters in the book, potentially content warnings. So how did you approach those? Because there's obviously the glory, like the drug dependency and the drugging, substance lacing. I don't know what the term for that would be, but our like you said, our characters do some not great things with those substances and just all the death and the violence and the racism. And then there's also PTSD from coming back from, you mentioned that there were war veterans. A couple of the characters are coming back from
Yeah.
Korea from the war. So how did you approach all those? I just want to like explore how you kind of like dark subjects and find a way to just make them like them, will integrate them to the story, but also keep yourself healthy with it, keep yourself alone, and then get yourself out of the zone, stuff like that.
the It's perspective. You're Some days you write a scene that is very close to the bone that will have elements in it that you pull from yourself personally, and then some are more or less what you can imagine. And I in particular, and people are going to ask, so I'm just going to go ahead and say about the morning glory seeds. So I didn't start out thinking, oh, I'm going to make Cleo's grandfather have a dependency of some kind. But I knew that I wanted them. Sorry, can you hear my dogs there? um,
It's okay, they wanna say hi.
I knew that I wanted him to be this super charismatic, larger than life figure in her life. And I wanted her to be somebody who had this capacity for this wild imagination. And I think what it came down to was, if there's one person that I knew in my family that was very charismatic and beautiful, and everybody, he was like the Pied Piper. You would have followed him anywhere, right? But there was a drug dependency, and it made him a dangerous person in a way because you were charmed by him, but then there's the fallout of that, and there are the consequences of that, and it was tragic. And I thought, she's this little girl. I wanted her to have somebody to look up to and somebody who was a bright spot in her life. But he is a tragic character because he is beautiful and he is imaginative and he is creative, and the thing that he uses in his paints are these morning glory seeds. And he tells her that's part of what inspires his work and puts the magic into his paintings, right? What he doesn't tell her is the truth of morning glory seeds, and I didn't know this. I had to go looking for it because I wanted her to think he had visions. And then I wanted Cleo to be able to experience something like that later. And a morning glory seed, if it's ground up, is basically LSD. And I didn't know that. So I found that in my research. But I was really specifically looking for what's the double edged sword for somebody who's super creative and charismatic and just lives in that fanciful sort of state of mind, taking risks. Because sometimes artists do. That's just something about that
Yeah.
personality. And so, in the search for how do you, if you're really having visions or if you're causing yourself to have visions, I landed on that. And so I was able to talk about that. And a lot of my personal memories of that family member went into that idea. The the PTSD, the idea that you come home from Korea and you've served in an integrated troop, maybe you're more hopeful than you should be when you come home. And the situation is not exactly what you expect, or maybe that's only because of your privilege that you come home hopeful, and so you're naive. And I wanted those things to be present for my characters, to think about those things, not necessarily the war that they just fought somewhere else, but what they were coming home to. How do you make home out of it?
Yeah.
And that racism aspect, because 1959, everything is just right on the cusp, right on the cusp. Everybody's starting to look around and go,
Mhm.
wait a second. Brown versus Ford had just happened, and it doesn't change fast. It's this little drip.
Yeah.
So I wanted to look at that.
Yeah, yeah, that it was like, yeah, those points in history were very interesting because you had to find that sweet spot or salty spot, whatever you want. I don't know if it is, but that spot that's gonna, like you said, that's like on the cusp, and things are starting to the tides are starting to turn, pun intended. I
Aha!
don't mean I'll be
Yeah,
here
and
all
I think
day,
it's a
but
hopeful story too. I think that's the other thing, that these people do have friendships. They do have relationships with one another, and there there are places that are segregated. There are places that are not. There are places that are self-segregated in this story, and we still live that way today. So I wanted to look at all of those things in this little town and try to imagine what was going through these people's heads in 1959. And we make a lot of assumptions. So I'm getting a lot of things wrong. I'm absolutely certain I'm getting a lot of things wrong, but I want to think about it.
yeah. Yeah, and you want your readers to think about it too, for sure. Because I could tell that you did your best to handle it with like care and authenticity, and also just challenging the narrative a little bit, or trying to explain, trying to add your own take on the narrative. And because obviously I read all sorts of books, but like, yeah, when I touch on the historical fiction, it does like those things that absolutely make you think like that. What was the context? What was the psyche of these people? Because a lot of the history, I think, in general, either from textbooks or traditional classroom instruction. It's a lot of facts and information and just like sequence of events and not a lot of what how did this affect this small population of people who like were a little isolated. And it's like, oh, it's like you introduce that where there's these group of people who are just they were on the island, they grew up on that land, and then all of a sudden these people come in and want to get their slice of it, and they're coming in and they're not native to that area. They are coming in and buying property and building property, and where there's that contention, there's that conflict because these people who are just like, what are you talking about? We're absolutely allowed to be here. This is we've been here.
Story
This is what we've
over
been
and
doing.
over and over again.
Yeah,
Yep, the tide comes in, the tide goes out.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's just so crazy how many different ways that there are as much as that those events keep getting like recycled somehow. There's just like a big cycle of it. It's just there's still so many interesting and creative ways to tell those that same
Right.
cycle and how it like just happens over and over again. Even not just in Georgia or off the island. It's like just anywhere almost
Anywhere.
like Europe, East Coast, West Coast, not like like
There you
South America,
go.
like every like so
And
many.
see, that's where the folk tales, because they're her grandfather's folk tales that are Scotch Irish folk tales that come down from Appalachia. And then there's
Mhm.
the folklore of the Lorelei that Frances Flood knows from her mother, whose lineage is German. And yet,
Yeah.
these stories exist all over the world, the same stories over and over again for a reason. There's a reason. And
Yeah.
I really
I
liked
know.
kind of messing around with that. It was fun.
Yeah. I could tell. Piggybacking off of that, I'm gonna throw this
Oh boy.
two-parter at you. What, because you talked about it a little bit too. Yeah. What were the most challenging parts to write? What were the most enjoyable parts to write?
I really got a kick out of writing the 1932 chapters. And my agent will laugh when she hears that because she always has to like, I'll turn in a book thinking it's completely finished. And she'll say, "All right, now where's the rest of it?" And she'll say, "I know this is in your head, but you have not put this on the page. Why is this not here?" And I'm like, "I don't know. That's not part of what I imagined. I don't know." And then we'll have two or three conversations, and then by the end of it, there'll be like a whole other half of the book that I have actually written because I do know it. Somehow, for some reason, there are pieces that I hold back. And the 1932 chapters were those pieces. The majority of it was there, but not all of it. I really, and this was original, I enjoyed writing the so called antagonists in this book. Ellis Piedmont was really entertaining to write. He was so awful and sad and manipulative, and I loved how he just pushed Cleo's
Mm.
buttons, and all of his dialogue just came right on the page. There was no trying, he was right there. And I really loved the relationship between Cleo and Joanna Burton because they seem like they are so different when you meet them. And then the longer that I was writing them, the more I realized they are so the same. They don't have any choices. None. No choices. They're both trying to manipulate this environment that they're in. And it is a tragic outcome for both of them. And Joanna, her life does not turn out as horribly as Cleo imagines, and then Cleo's life doesn't turn out as wonderfully as Joanna thinks it will. So there's
Mm.
wonderful
Mm.
twists. And aren't there people that you meet like that you just hate, but you're also in love with them? You want to be them. Um, you want to never see them again. Like it's this contentious
Yeah.
thing, and then they stay with you your whole life. And that idea that you can do a thing in your youth. Something about the mistakes that we make in our youth are so powerful, and they can set your life on a
Yeah.
course, and your choices that echoed over and over again for me. What choice do I have? What choice do I have? Do I have a choice? And Joanna
Right.
talking about that in those chapters, and Cleo believing she has no choices, even from the start, and then in the end realizing it's all choices, it's all choices. And I really liked writing the antagonists, which I didn't expect, but I liked the
Mhm.
both of them a lot.
Y I think that's a little common just because it's you get to do what the socially
Mhm.
unacceptable parts of
Mhm.
life, and you can see, I like how Ellis, it's yeah, he's like a horrible person, but I still
I
felt
know.
bad for him. But you still feel sympathy for him because, and even though it's so, yeah, it's just like it's multidimensional, right? Because it's like you're like, girl, why are you doing this? But then no, I get why you're doing this.
She's
It's like
such a terrible judge of
it's yeah.
character. Even up to the very end, I'm like, no, you're wrong. Like about every single person, she like makes the just a point judgment right at the very start, right from the get go about everybody, and she's always wrong. You think by the time she's older, she would be like, oh, I need to like consider, but she never does. And I think at the end, she has changed. I hope all of them have changed to some degree. They're still themselves, but they're at a point
Yeah.
of change. And I like to think that because of meeting Frances, who is a second chance for Cleo, because she's Joanna's daughter,
Mhm.
and having met Audrey, who I think is a little bit like Cleo. Cleo sees herself in Audrey, that maybe they give each other another chance.
But yeah, with Audrey, I saw that, oh, what might have been
Yeah.
for Cleo almost. If she would have made some different choices, she might have ended up similar to what Audrey is
Mhm.
doing for herself now, and a real part of the community.
Right.
Like, people know her, she's there, people are there for her, even though it's like a little ironic too, because the events in the story, she notices like the people who I've seen do this, and now they're here doing this, and then they're back doing this, and it's just acting I'm not a part of, I'm not your neighbor. You're acting like totally what is going on. And then they want to act like they didn't make certain decisions or they weren't acting crazy. And yeah, it's just like it all, like as the reader, I'm just like reflecting on it. And it was just really cool to see those juxtapositions of what were these three women's lives, how so much like what might have been. And it's like in the flesh for Cleo to
Hmm.
see. This is like physical, a real person. This is here showing you what the little like Joanne can see or could have been
Hmm.
your own way of life, stuff like that. So I'm gonna throw this at you again. What advice do you have for Cleo, for Audrey, for Francis?
Ooh, that is a good question. I feel like I need to lay down on your couch.
Yeah.
Like a little psychology here. What advice do I
There
have?
you go. Yep.
For Cleo, it is to learn to trust people. Cleo doesn't trust anybody, including herself. So, learning to trust, I think, is important for her. For Frances, it's to have some fun. Because Frances, I feel like, has she is the oldest child in this story. She's not, but
Yeah.
that's her character. She is very practical. Everything is buttoned down all the time, and she's starting to learn to loosen up a little bit. And still, again, trust, I think, is her issue too. Same thing, control. And then with Audrey, to trust herself, because Audrey's coming into herself. Audrey's newlywed and right out of high school. And I think about that a lot. Like when I think about how young our mothers were when they got married, right out of high, like they stepped out of their graduation and into the church, and there they were, right, with a baby already. And that's where Audrey is
Mhm.
in 1959. And she can't even imagine that she's an adult. At the beginning of the book, she still feels like she fits with the kids in town, and she's already widowed. So, like, how do I make that step? It's she just missed a whole chunk of what her life should have been. And so, I guess I want her to do that. I want her to step into herself and to still be a young woman, but to be a woman. All of them, that means they have to trust people.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's solid advice all around, even for everyone on land, everyone on that island. Just it's really, it comes down to, for lack of better words, people are like, I think most of the time they're not really against you, they're just out for themselves, and it's hard to not take for that it's hard not to take actions
Yeah.
personally, because it's just trust people, but you like, yeah, absolutely trust yourself, trust your instinct, trust like your gut, trust, and hopefully you won't steer yourself wrong. Because even reminds me with Cleo, like, she knew what she was doing was wrong, and she was still it was eating away at her once it all blew up, and it was way too late for her to take any
Yep.
of it back, and it was just like, "Girl, yeah, okay, this is what
And
this
then she
never."
got what she wanted, which was like the worst.
Yeah, I know. You're like,
I
"This is what
know.
happens." You're, like, writing your story, you're like, "You're gonna learn." Here, Kimberly Brock, what is next for you? Are you working on anything that you could talk about?
I don't like to talk about it too much. It's like the idea is sitting in the corner smoking a cigar, and if I look at it directly and it knows, then, then it won't work for me.
Like,
Yeah,
don't make
don't
eye
let it know you
contact,
see
like
it. And that's a little bit Cleo, isn't it? I'm giving myself away. This one is set in the Blue Ridge Mountains near Asheville, North Carolina. And it is another Southern Gothic. It's fairly creepy. There's a big old house. There are two little old lady sisters who've been living in this house for 45 years. And they refuse to speak to one another for
mm,
45 years in the house. I
oh
know.
my god.
And something happens when the book opens, and that they were both in love with the same boy. We'll just say that. And there are some
Okay.
creepy aspects to it, and I'm excited about it. It's finally a book I'm writing away from the coast. All three of my first novels have been on the coast, so I'm moving up into the mountains for a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So we're gonna use that
Yeah.
nature though, I'm sure. Like, still gonna set the tone with good
Yep.
old Mother Earth. Yeah, I know. I that's like say yeah, like the environment or the place setting is can be just as much of a character as like the people or even like pets. Like it's just, or the animals or wildlife or anything. It's how characters react to it and vice versa. And it's so cool to like remind readers of the big
Yeah.
picture of like how important all of that is. But yeah, Kimberly Brock, where can we find you online and on social media?
So you can find my website at kimberlybrockbooks.com. And all of my social media is on there. I'm on it frequently. So I love to hear from people. And I'm doing a huge book tour for this book, which kicks off tomorrow with the book launch. I'll be in conversation at Foxtel Bookshop with Mary Kay Andrews.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exciting. I know it's funny when I talk to authors, it's even if I've talked to them like a month after the book's been out, things are still crazy for them because they're
Yeah.
still in like promo mode or getting the feedback and all that. Like they're still trying to keep their head on straight and keep their dates straight and all their
Yep.
schedule
I think
and just riding the excitement, riding the wave, riding
it
like
is a
all of
lot.
that, all those
And I'm
emotions and
such an
stuff like that.
introvert, so like
Yeah.
I feel like I'm about to be shot out of a cannon. I think there's going to be 22 events for this fall tour. So
Oh
yeah.
wow.
So surely you can find me somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And all that
Yes.
information's on your website of
Yep.
where you're gonna be? Or on social media, I'm assuming that
Yep.
you're posting it. Yeah, because 'cause we'll make sure listeners and readers know where to stalk you
Please
if they want
do.
to,
I'm
so
around. I feel like Lucy with my sign
er
out. I'm ready. The psychiatrist is in.
there you go, yep. Kimberly Brock, The Fabled Earth, that book is available tomorrow, available now, we'll say. Thank you so much for joining me. It's such an awesome conversation. I love learning about your process and all the details and getting into that, the psychology of it all. And yeah, when and if you're ready to talk about your next title, feel free to come back. Love
I
to chat
will.
again.
Thank you so much. It was great.
And there you go. That was Kimberly Brock talking about The Fabled Earth. That book is available now. Check out the show notes where you can find links where to find Kimberly online and on social media. While you're browsing around social media, please find cantinabookclub.com. And also on YouTube, you can also check out full videos of interviews as well. If you need book recommendations, check out my in depth book reviews on cantinabookclub.com. Subscribe if you can, rate, review, all that good stuff. It really helps me out. If you're finding authors and their titles and books that you like, please, if you can, go ahead and hop on over to Goodreads and Amazon and give them a reading or review. It really does help them out, along with pre-orders and in general, just ordering their books and spreading the word about it. And as always, thank you guys so much for listening.